All right, guys, chapter 4, where we talk about economic efficiency and we also talk about when the government gets involved in prices. So, we first have to talk about consumer and producer surplus. Then we talk about what's an efficient and inefficient competitive market. And then we're going to talk about what happens when the government steps in and taxes, which also influences, how much we pay. So, surplus is the idea of the benefit that you get from engaging in a transaction. So you're not willing to pay more for something than it's worth to you, and so the how much it's worth versus how much you pay, the difference there is really the surplus. Or for a business that's almost like profit. So consumer surplus we measure as the difference between the highest price a consumer is willing to pay for a good and what they actually paid for it. So if you've ever bid on eBay, and you can go in and you can set your maximum bid. This is the most I'm willing to go for it. So if you said the most I'm willing to pay for this is 15, and then you end up getting it for 12, the difference between the max you would have been willing to pay and what you actually got it for, that difference, in this case $3, would be your consumer surplus. And for a producer surplus, it's the lowest price a firm would be willing to accept, which is generally going to be their cost and what they actually receive for it. So again, if you go back to eBay, it's kind of like the minimum bid that they would accept. This is the minimum I'll accept for it. Anything they got over that, the difference there would be the surplus. So if we look at it on a graph, um, if Teresa is just going to buy, and this is kind of the difference too, because it matters the quantity. If I was only going to buy, or Teresa's only going to buy one chai tea, she'd be willing to pay $6 for it. Tom would only be willing to pay 5. Tim would only be willing to pay $3. So we take the difference, between all of those. So if we say the price turns out to be $3.50, like this, okay. If the price is $3.50, Tim wouldn't get any because he would only be willing to pay 3. And the difference here, so Teresa, the difference between the max she would have paid and what she actually paid, this is Teresa's consumer surplus. Tom would have been willing to pay 5. He ended up getting it for $3.50. So this difference right here is Tom's surplus, and Terry's surplus is only 50 cents because she was only willing to pay 4 and she got it for $3.50. So that's each person's individual surplus. So if we take Teresa's surplus right here, and then with that price of $3.50, and then we add Tom's to it, and we add Terry's to it, you put them all together, and so A plus B plus C equals the total consumer surplus, okay? So we put each person's individual surplus, and again, some of them are going to benefit more than others, or because they would have been willing to pay more. So if we did this for everybody in the market, we end up getting a demand curve that looks like this. And so what we really get for each single person, this is just 3 people, but if we were to continue this out, it looks like this. Consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price. So the area, it's this triangle here between the demand curve and the price. So consumer surplus that's how we look at it on a graph. This is showing if the price was $2. So you've got all these different people here, but below the demand curve and above the price, in between these two areas right there, that whole rectangle is consumer surplus. So we have a similar thing for the producer surplus. So for the consumer surplus, we're talking about consumer benefit, right? And when we're going to look at this a little bit later, but we call marginal benefit, the benefit from one more thing. With producer surplus, it's much the same thing, except kind of in the opposite. The lowest price a firm would have been willing to accept versus what they actually got it for. The lowest price they originally would be willing to sell for it is really the cost. So we talk about marginal cost, which is the cost of producing one more good or service. Um, and so it's producing one more unit. So sometimes it's just the cost of like supplies, the marginal cost. Sometimes to make one more unit, I'd have to bring on a whole nother shift, or if I'm operating at capacity to do one more unit, I'd have to build a whole nother plant. So it can change based on their volume, but it's the cost of producing one more unit. So here's the cost of producing 1 cup, essentially the cost of producing 2 cups, 3 cups, like that. And so uh, the cost of producing the 4th cup is up to $2.25, so they wouldn't sell it if it was $2. But again, the difference, and this could be different firms too, okay, in the market. In this case, I just have one as a simple. But again, um, uh, it could be by the cup, or it could be a different producer here. So here's the marginal cost for firm A, for firm B. We put them all together, and again, we get this, which is going to be our supply curve. And so what we're looking at is the area below the price down to the supply curve. And this is the same thing. I take each person's or each firm's and add them all together, and it looks like this. So I've got, this is for all sellers then, put them all together, and it looks like this. Here's the supply curve. Here's the price, and the area in between the two, this whole triangle right here. I think I said rectangle before. It's a triangle. That's where that's producer surplus. It's producer benefit. It's the difference between, you could think of it like profit, even though it's not quite profit. But so what does this tell us? So consumer surplus is the market. It's the total benefit received by consumers minus the total they have to pay. So the total benefit received minus the amount that they must pay. So it's their net benefit. So the more benefit they receive, or the less the amount they have to pay, the more the net benefit's going to be there. Producer surplus is equal to the amount they receive from consumers minus the cost. So it's essentially their profit, right? Their revenue, right, minus their expenses equals their profit. So an efficient market, okay, an efficient market is one that wants to maximize total surplus. So if we take so total economic surplus is the total consumer surplus plus the total producer surplus. You put those two together, and we've got economic surplus. So that's an efficient market looks to maximize economic surplus. To be honest, from this point of view, you don't care if it's on the consumer side or the producer side, as long as someone is benefiting from this transaction. So the total is economic surplus. So when we look at a graph and we look at an efficient market, it looks like this. So this market is at equilibrium at a price of $2, and they're selling 15,000 cups a day. So this blue area up here is the consumer surplus, the area between the demand curve and the price. The area between the supply curve and the price is the producer surplus. So the triangle down here on the bottom is the producer surplus. The whole thing, this whole shaded area, both the red and the blue shaded area, is economic surplus. So when we see this whole big triangle, that is maximum economic surplus. That's what we want. And that's what we see when we're at equilibrium, okay? So when we're at equilibrium, we're maximizing consumer surplus. Now, when we, in the last chapter, we looked at what happens if we're charging a price that is not at equilibrium and we end up with a surplus or a shortage, right? So here's why that's bad, all right? Then, and this is kind of the explanation for that. So we started out, this market here was, I'm just going to draw this. So this area right here was the consumer surplus. So at equilibrium, the consumer surplus is A, B, and C, and the producer surplus is the area over here. So this is at a price of $2. So D and E is the producer surplus. Now, and that's what we want. That's that whole triangle. That's what we saw on the last page. However, at a price of 220, so I'm going to erase this. At a price of 220, I go right here, right? So here's the new price. I come to demand first. So the quantity demanded is 14,000, but I would come all the way up here to get the quantity supplied, and I don't know, we'll just say that's 16,000. I don't know. So now I've got a surplus, right? So the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. But so what happens is until that adjusts to equilibrium, I'm right here, okay? So I'm only going to sell 14,000 because at that price only 14,000 are demanded. So I essentially am going to cut this off right here, okay? So consumers, this is now the consumer surplus, the area between the new price and the demand curve. So consumer surplus went down to just A. Now, we said producer surplus is the area between the price and the supply curve. But these, they only sell 14,000, so it cuts it off right here. So the producer surplus is now this area right here, B and D. Now this area B got transferred. That used to be consumer surplus, and now it's producer surplus. So it got moved from the consumer to the producer. We're not really that concerned about that because somebody's still benefiting, okay? But this area, because we only sold 14,000, these guys right here didn't get sold to anybody. So neither the consumer nor the producer benefits. So this is what we call dead weight loss, okay? That's this area C and E. So B isn't really a problem. It got transferred from one group to another. But C and E are a problem because nobody, neither the consumers nor the producers, benefit from this. And so that economically speaking, just like kind of we talk about trade, there's winners and there's losers. But we have the same thing in here, but really the losers are losing more than the winners are winning. And so that's why it's economically inefficient. So if we look at those two on the same graph, so here's what it would look like at competitive equilibrium, right? Here's consumer surplus, here's producer surplus. That's what it looks like at equilibrium. This is what it looks like at a price that is not equilibrium. And so here's consumer, here's producer, and then this is dead weight loss. Nobody wins that, okay? If we had a price that was below equilibrium, we'd have a very similar thing, except that the consumers would be gaining, the producers would be losing, and so it would be kind of the flip-flop of this one. So that's basically the idea behind consumer and producer surplus.